The Gulfstream Evan Rourke spent 6 weeks restoring sat gleaming under the hangar lights when he placed the invoice on the table, and the executives laughed and declared they had no intention of paying. They assumed a debt-ridden single father would stay quiet to protect his reputation. Evan did not argue. He pulled his certification card from his pocket, set it beside the hangar key, and walked out in silence. 10 minutes later, Vivian Ashcroft ordered the aircraft to depart. But every pilot who approached that jet stepped back, opened the logbook, and said the same thing. Without Evan's signature, no one was flying. If you believe integrity is always worth it, stay until the end and watch the truth take flight. Rain was still hitting the tarmac at Blackridge Executive Airfield when Evan Rourke pulled his truck past the security gate, the kind of cold Carolina rain that came sideways and made everything outside look temporary. He had received the call 3 hours earlier from a man named Miles Voss, operations director for Ashcroft Meridian Holdings, who described the job in 4 clipped sentences as though summarizing a memo. The aircraft in question was a Gulfstream 550, the personal jet of the late Conrad Ashcroft, grounded for nearly 2 years after a combined electrical and hydraulic failure that no one had properly documented and no one had been in a hurry to fix. 3 larger maintenance firms had given the aviation team wait times measured in months, and Miles had explained that months were something the company did not have. A merger was closing in 6 weeks, and the jet needed to be airworthy before then. Evan asked 2 questions about the last known maintenance date and the condition of the hydraulic lines, and then said he would come take a look before agreeing to anything. What he found inside Hangar 7 made him stand still for a long moment, with his flashlight cutting through the dark. The Gulfstream was not simply grounded. It had been worked on, badly, by someone who understood the basic geography of an aircraft but not the principles behind it, and then abandoned mid-repair as though whoever had started the job had been pulled away by something more urgent or more convenient. Wiring bundles had been disconnected, and left that way, a hydraulic accumulator had been replaced with a unit that carried no traceable part number, and the maintenance logs were missing entire entries that should have covered the previous 30 months of operation. Evan had seen deferred maintenance before, had seen aircraft pushed past their service intervals by operators who trusted luck more than procedure, but this was different. This looked like someone had deliberately made the work harder to follow. Miles Voss arrived at the hangar 20 minutes later in a suit that cost more than Evan's last monthly payment to the bank, and he laid out the terms with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to people agreeing before the conversation ended. The contract would cover parts, labor, and a completion bonus if Evan delivered the aircraft on schedule, and Miles said the number aloud in a tone designed to sound like generosity rather than a negotiation. Evan asked for the complete maintenance records, all of them, including any third-party service orders. And Miles said he would have someone pull together what was available, which was not the same thing as saying the records existed. The conversation ended with Miles telling Evan that the job just needed to get the aircraft flying, that previous work just needed to be finished up, and that Evan should not let paperwork get in the way of the practical side of things. Evan was still crouching under the forward avionics bay when a second set of footsteps echoed through the hangar, lighter and more deliberate, and he looked up to find Vivian Ashcroft standing inside the door with her coat still damp from the rain. She was 38, composed in the way people are composed when they have been trained since childhood never to let a room see them off balance, and she studied him with the specific skepticism reserved for people who have received too many professional assessments and have stopped believing any of them. She asked if he could deliver what the other firms had declined to take on, and Evan stood up slowly, wiped his hands on a shop cloth, and told her he could not promise the aircraft would be ready in 6 weeks. only that it would not leave the hangar before it was safe. The look at him suggested a woman deciding whether an answer was a refusal or a warning, and she said nothing before turning back toward the rain. Nora called while Evan was locking the truck, her voice carrying the particular combination of lightness and concern that teenagers deploy when they want to know something difficult without appearing to ask. He told her the job looked big, told her he would let her know how it went, and said nothing about the loan notice sitting on his desk at home or the number of weeks remaining before the bank's patience expired. He drove away from Blackridge, knowing the work was 3 times the size of what Miles has described, and that he needed every dollar of it to arrive on time, and neither of those things changed what he would require before signing his name to anything. It was only when he pulled a panel beneath the main avionics rack and lifted it clear that he found it. A component installed where a different component should have been, carrying a serial number that matched no manufacturer's catalog entry he had ever seen, occupying a position in the system that governed the aircraft's directional flight surfaces. Lena Brooks arrived the following morning with a hard case full of diagnostic equipment, and the particular expression she wore when she had already decided a job was going to be worse than advertised, but was coming anyway. She had worked alongside Evan for 11 years, knew his methodology the way musicians know a band leader's tempo, and she had enough experience with avionics anomalies to understand that an unregistered serial number on a flight control component was not a clerical error. It was either incompetence or something considerably worse. They brought in 2 other technicians, both certified, both trusted, and the 4 of them divided the aircraft into zones and began working systematically from nose to tail, cataloging every anomaly, every missing log entry, every component that did not match the documentation on file. Miles began delaying parts approvals within the first week, and Evan responded by drawing against his personal line of credit to order the components that could not wait: hydraulic seals, wiring harness sections, a replacement pressurization controller the aircraft desperately needed. Each time Evan filed a progress report detailing a new system failure discovered during inspection, Miles acknowledged it with language that made the findings sound like nuisances rather than safety concerns. And the reports that reached Vivian had been edited to single-paragraph summaries that described Evan as running over budget and behind schedule. She called the hangar on day 9 to say she was hearing concerns about the pace of progress, and Evan told her the pace was determined by what he found, not what anyone had expected to find, and that if she wanted to discuss specifics, he would lay every inspection report in front of her unedited. She arrived that afternoon to find him on his back beneath a wiring conduit, pulling a connector apart with his bare hands because the torque felt wrong, and she watched him work for several minutes without saying anything. When he sat up and showed her the connector, its internal contact bent in a way that would have passed a visual inspection but would have eventually caused an intermittent autopilot failure. She did not apologize for her earlier tone, but she did not repeat it either. She was beginning to notice, completely indifferent to the fact that she was the person paying him, which was not a quality she encountered often, and one she was not certain she liked, though she could not locate any ground on which to object to it. Lena had been running the unregistered serial number through every accessible database since day 2, and on day 12 she found it. A component supplied by a company called Vanguard Aero Supply, a firm incorporated 3 years earlier that had billed Ashcroft Meridian's aviation division for more than $4 million in parts over its short existence. Every purchase order, every approval signature, and every disbursement record traced back to a single name. She printed the records and brought them to Evan the way she always brought him findings that changed the shape of a problem. Without drama, without editorial, just the paper and the silence for him to read it in. Inside the forward cabin, while recalibrating the cockpit instrumentation, Evan noticed a photograph tucked into the side pocket of the pilot's seat. Conrad Ashcroft standing beside the aircraft on a sunny tarmac, one arm around a teenage Vivian, both of them squinting against the light. He replaced the photograph exactly as he had found it. On the instrument panel, a small mechanical clock with a cracked crystal had been left in place by every technician who had worked on the aircraft before him, and Evan cleaned its face carefully with a soft cloth before moving on to the next item in his sequence. Lena's voice was quiet when she told him which system the unregistered component governed: directional flight control. A failure at that position, she said, would cost a pilot the ability to steer the aircraft at any altitude. Evan submitted the formal request to replace the entire flight control assembly the next morning, and Miles rejected it before noon. The schedule did not permit a full assembly replacement, Miles explained in a message routed through Vivian's assistant, and the component in question had been cleared by a certified engineer whose documentation was already on file. Evan pulled the name from the file, checked the certification records, and found the engineer had left the company's employ 14 months before the date printed on his sign-off. Someone had used his name on a document after he was gone. Evan photographed the discrepancy, noted it in his private log, and continued working, because the people who falsify records do not stop when they are suspected, they accelerate. 3 days later, he discovered that the addendum to his original contract had been altered. The delivery date, which had been listed as a target, had been rewritten as a binding deadline, and the penalty clause attached to it would allow Ashcroft Meridian to withhold all final payment if the aircraft was not delivered by that date. Evan had not initialed any revision. He retrieved his email record of the original and filed both documents together. Vivian came to the hangar at 9 in the evening, running on 4 hours of sleep and the particular tension of someone who has been told 2 contradictory things about the same situation and has not yet decided which to believe. Miles had told her Evan was threatening to withhold delivery unless he received payment beyond the original contract, that the delays were deliberate leverage, and that the company should consider legal action if he did not comply by end of week. She said all of this directly, standing in the center of the hangar with the aircraft large and still between them. Evan listened without interrupting, then reached into his work bag, retrieved a single bolt, and placed it on the tool chest between them. He told her to compare it to the part number listed on the most recent Vanguard Aero Supply invoice for that assembly. The bolt was from the aircraft's directional control linkage, and when Vivian pulled the invoice up and looked at the part description, the specifications did not match what she was holding in her hand. She did not say anything for a moment, and Evan did not press her, because he understood the difference between a person considering the implications and a person looking for a reason to dismiss them. Miles arrived at the hangar within 15 minutes, meaning someone had called him, and explained to Vivian that minor component substitutions were standard practice, that the parts were functionally equivalent, and that Evan was dramatizing a routine procurement variation to manufacture the appearance of a safety crisis. He said it with the ease of a man who had said something very close to that sentence many times before. Then he turned to Evan and said, quietly enough that Vivian would not quite catch the words, that a man with a bank foreclosure notice on his property was not in an advantageous position for a legal contest with a company that employed 40 attorneys. Evan nodded once, went back to work, and that night copied every file, photograph, and data record he had assembled onto 3 separate drives stored in 3 separate locations. Vivian came back alone at 11:30 with 2 cups of coffee, and they sat on the maintenance steps for a while without talking about the aircraft. She asked about his daughter. He said she was ready to be somewhere new. He asked how long her father had owned the plane. She said since before she could remember, and her voice moved in a way she did not try to conceal. By morning, every Vanguard Aero Supply file had been deleted from the company's maintenance server. The deletion confirmed what Evan and Lena already suspected, and because Lena had anticipated it, she had already cloned the relevant server directories onto an encrypted external drive she kept in the inner pocket of her jacket. She spread the printouts across a folding table the next morning and began cross-referencing serial numbers, invoice dates, and installation records with the methodical patience of someone who understands that evidence only matters if it is unbroken. While she worked, Evan tracked down a legitimate flight control assembly from a decommissioned aircraft at a salvage facility in Tennessee, verified its certification lineage from original manufacture through its last recorded inspection, and wired a deposit from his personal account because Miles had stopped approving any expenditures above $1,000 without a 48-hour review. The final 2 weeks of work did not look dramatic from the outside. Bench calibration, system integration tests, ground power checks, the slow confirmation that each repaired system communicated correctly with every other. But it carried a different quality of attention, because everyone in the hangar knew someone had previously cut corners in that aircraft, and that the consequences would not land on the person who had cut them. The morning the engines turned over for the first time, the sound traveled through the hangar floor and up through the walls, and 2 of the technicians actually stopped and stood there listening. Lena allowed herself a single exhaled breath of satisfaction before picking up her clipboard again. Vivian arrived without notice while the auxiliary power unit was still running, and she stood at the hangar entrance for a moment without walking in, as though she needed time before letting herself be fully present. When she came forward and placed one hand along the lower edge of the fuselage, Evan, who recognized that gesture, did not interrupt it. She thanked him in a register that had nothing to do with professional courtesy. The voice people use when they are speaking about something that cannot be fully articulated, and they are proceeding anyway. Miles was already in motion before Evan finished explaining that the inspection was not complete, that a final systems verification remained, and that provenance for all flight-critical components needed independent confirmation before any airworthiness sign-off. He stepped forward with a delivery schedule on company letterhead and explained that the merger timeline was fixed, that the aircraft would be released to flight operations by morning. Evan said the inspection timeline was also fixed, and that it was fixed by safe operation rather than by any business transaction. That evening, without Evan's knowledge, Miles directed a technician to return a box of old Vanguard components to the hangar storage room, positioning them where they could later be characterized as unauthorized parts Evan had sourced himself. The technician did as instructed and did not ask questions, which was a pattern Miles had been cultivating for years. Evan submitted the completed invoice the following morning. $240,000, itemized across labor, authorized parts, the funds he had personally advanced, and the completion bonus stipulated in the original contract. Miles convened a meeting with the legal team before lunch. When it concluded, Evan was notified that Ashcroft Meridian was withholding final payment pending investigation into alleged contract violations, including the deadline he had not agreed to and parts he had not purchased. Miles delivered the conclusion himself, standing in the hangar doorway with the composure of a man observing the formality of an outcome already decided. He told Evan the company would not be paying. He offered a smaller sum, directly to Evan personally, in exchange for a signed airworthiness certificate. Evan placed the hangar key on the workbench. He kept the certification card. He told Miles that Ashcroft owned the aircraft, but that no one in the building had the authority to declare it safe to fly. The following morning arrived clear and cold, and Vivienne came to Blackridge with a car service and a schedule that required wheels up by 9. Miles had briefed her that Evan had abandoned the project after failing to extract additional payment, that the aircraft had been properly completed, and that a sign-off from another technician would be handled within the hour. She walked into the terminal believing the situation had been managed, that the delay had cost them nothing beyond a contract dispute, and that the inconvenience was behind her. She did not yet know that Captain Grant Hale had been in the hangar since 7:30. Grant was 55 years old, had flown Conrad Ashcroft to 6 continents, and possessed the specific professional gravity of a man who had spent 3 decades understanding that physics does not negotiate with a pilot on behalf of a schedule. He had opened the maintenance logbook, read Evan's technical notes, observed the absence of a final airworthiness certification, and placed the logbook back on the table with the finality of someone whose decision was made and would not be improved by further conversation. When Miles told him the certification would be issued by end of day and he could begin pre-flight, Grant said he would begin pre-flight when the certification was issued, and that those two events were not interchangeable. Miles called the backup first officer. The first officer asked if Evan Rourke had cleared the aircraft, and when Miles said Rourke was no longer involved, the first officer said he was not available for that departure. 2 contract pilots were reached by phone and offered double their standard rate. The first declined when the dispatcher mentioned the incomplete sign-off, and the second came to the field, walked around the aircraft, read the logbook entry where Evan had flagged the unresolved control assembly anomaly, and drove away without going inside. Vivienne asked Grant directly why he would not fly. Grant told her about the morning he had arrived at the hangar to find a young maintenance technician refusing to let Conrad Ashcroft board the aircraft until a fuel feed irregularity was corrected. A problem Conrad had dismissed as minor, a problem Evan had documented in 3 pages of handwritten notes, a problem later confirmed by the manufacturer to be a known defect capable of causing engine failure in crews. Conrad had been furious, had threatened Evan's job in front of witnesses, had told him he was overstepping his authority. 2 weeks later, Conrad sent Evan a letter. Grant said he had never read it but had heard it described, and that from that day forward, Conrad had trusted Evan's signature because he had watched what it cost Evan to withhold it. Miles proposed finding a third-party inspector to issue the certificate on an expedited basis. 3 names were contacted. Each said the same thing. When a technician of Evan Rourke's standing had written an open technical discrepancy into a maintenance log, no responsible inspector would sign over it without a physical resolution. The discrepancy Evan had entered was specific, documented, and referenced an unverifiable component serial number. The kind of entry that could not be dismissed without examining the component itself. The merger's closing window was narrowing. A question appeared in a financial newsletter about whether Ashcroft Meridian's leadership transition was proceeding smoothly. The board sent Vivienne 3 messages before noon. Miles told her the situation was Evan holding the company for a larger payment, and she stood in the terminal looking at the aircraft on the tarmac and thought about the bolt he had placed on the tool chest and the way the part numbers had not matched. She walked back into the hangar alone. She opened the small private cabinet built into the bulkhead behind the co-pilot's seat, the one Conrad had always kept locked. Inside, beneath a folded navigational chart, was a sealed envelope with a name written in her father's handwriting, Evan Rourke. The letter was 4 paragraphs, handwritten on Ashcroft Meridian letterhead, dated 3 years before Conrad's death. He had written it after a maintenance review he described as having opened his eyes to something he had been allowing himself not to see, and the tone was not corporate. It was a man writing something he intended to act on, but had not yet decided when. Conrad wrote that the only reason any aircraft in his fleet had remained airworthy was because there were still people in the maintenance chain who refused to treat their professional signature as a courtesy, who understood that certification existed not to document that work had been done, but to guarantee it had been done correctly. He wrote that such people were inconvenient, expensive, and absolutely essential, and that any operation that allowed them to be pressured into compromise had already begun to fail, even if no one had noticed yet. The second item in the cabinet was a small voice recorder, and when Vivian pressed play, she heard her father's voice in a quality that felt wrong and right at the same time, too close, too immediate, filling the cabin with a presence absent for 18 months. The recording was a conversation between Conrad and Miles, made approximately 8 weeks before Conrad died, and in it Conrad was asking, in the patient tone he used when he already knew the answer and was giving someone the chance to tell the truth before he arrived at it himself, why the aviation division's maintenance budget had increased by 31% over 3 years without any corresponding increase in fleet size or flight hours. Miles's explanation was smooth and detailed and plausible, and Conrad said he understood, and then at the end of the recording, Conrad said he was going to request a full audit of all third-party vendor relationships in the aviation division following his return from the upcoming international trip. The recording ended there. Conrad had not returned from that trip. Vivian drove to Rourke Airworks and arrived to find a bank closure notice on the front door and Evan inside, stacking tools into crates with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided to keep moving because stopping will not improve anything. She told him about the letter and the recording. She said she was prepared to pay the invoice immediately and asked him to return and complete the certification. Evan set down the wrench he was holding and told her that his signature covered the entirety of the aircraft, including every component installed before he arrived, and that payment could not change the provenance of a flight control part that traced to no legitimate source. She asked what he needed. He said he needed an independent inspection authority with no connection to Ashcroft Meridian's procurement chain, a full component traceability review on every flight-critical part, and full payment to his team regardless of the review's outcome. He said the problem was not the work he had done. It was the work done before him, work someone had tried to hide inside his own. He spread the copies across a work table, the serial number records, the Vanguard invoices, the falsified engineer sign-off, the timestamp data showing the server deletion, the original contract alongside the altered version. She stood reading for 20 minutes while he continued packing. Vivian told him she had signed the payment hold order. He said he knew. She waited for some expression of grievance, and he did not provide one, only asked whether she had read the same information he had been looking at from the beginning, or only the version Miles had wanted her to see. When she looked at everything laid out on that work table, she understood they were not the same thing at all. She took out her phone and called the chairman of the board. Vivian did not confront Miles that evening. She had observed enough of how he operated to understand that a direct confrontation before the evidence was secured would produce a controlled destruction of what remained, and she told the board chairman only that she was initiating an internal audit and needed 48 hours. Miles heard through whatever channel he maintained inside the boardroom that she was slowing things down, interpreted this as uncertainty, and began moving accordingly. He directed the removal of the stored Vanguard components from the hangar storage room and arranged for them to be transported to a facility outside the airfield. Lena, who had been given access to the independent auditor's tracking system, flagged the shipping manifest when it appeared, and the auditors intercepted the delivery at a warehouse registered to an LLC whose sole listed officer was the brother-in-law of Miles Voss. Inside, investigators found 312 components across 17 categories. none with valid airworthiness certification, many bearing counterfeit manufacturer markings, all with billing records from Ashcroft Meridian stretching back 4 years. The markup on each item averaged 260% over comparable legitimate parts. Miles had prepared for questions about his procurement activities to arise in a legal context, where documents could be explained and timelines disputed. Not for them to arise in a conference room where Vivian Ashcroft sat at the head of the table with the voice recorder from her father's aircraft. He attempted the explanation he had been preparing. The components were legitimate alternatives from a supplier operating outside conventional channels. The pricing reflected expedited availability, and Rourke Airworks had itself used unauthorized parts. The very parts currently sitting in the hangar storage room. He said this last part with confidence, because he had put those parts there himself. Evan had brought the hangar's internal access log. Every entry to the storage room was time-stamped, including the entry made by Miles's technician the previous evening, hours after Evan had submitted his invoice. The parts had arrived after the invoice. The installation records Evan had maintained showed every component actually used in the aircraft, with corresponding documentation for each one, and the gap between what Miles had deposited and what was installed was a gap that Miles could not explain without explaining the middle-of-the-night visit. Miles shifted his approach and addressed the board directly, reminding them that Evan had been terminated by a larger firm 7 years prior, that his operation had a history of contract disputes, and that his financial distress gave him every incentive to manufacture a crisis. Evan said the termination was accurate, and the reason was also a matter of record. He had refused to certify a component batch, purchased from an unapproved vendor, been asked to revise his inspection report, declined, and been let go. That firm had recalled the entire component batch 11 months later following a federal aviation investigation. The recall documentation was on page 12 of the materials already before the board. Miles had no answer for page 12. Vivian suspended Miles pending investigation, authorized the payment release, and opened the full procurement audit. Then the auditors added a detail that changed the shape of everything. The suspect component Class Lena had flagged on the Gulfstream had also been installed on 2 other aircraft in the Ashcroft Meridian private fleet, both of which had made dozens of flights in the preceding 18 months. Vivian grounded the entire private fleet before the board meeting adjourned. She made the call herself from the conference room, and the flight operations coordinator confirmed the hold within 60 seconds. The decision produced immediate and substantial financial exposure. Executive itineraries canceled, international meetings requiring rescheduling, a publicly visible operational disruption that financial reporters would notice before end of trading. 3 board members told her she was overreacting. She told them overreacting was installing verified safe components before the next departure, and she was prepared to discuss any other interpretation of that after the inspections were complete. Miles offered his resignation that evening in a voicemail couched in language about the company's best interests, attached to an unspoken premise that a quiet exit served both parties, that a resignation was preferable to an investigation, that certain facts could remain internal if the matter was handled as a personnel issue. Vivian forwarded the voicemail to outside counsel and instructed them to coordinate with federal aviation authorities. Evan and Lena spent 2 days going through the remaining 2 aircraft with the same systematic attention they had brought to the Gulfstream. They found the same class of component in the flight control systems of both, the same Vanguard provenance, the same absence of traceable certification, the same pattern of installation during maintenance windows that had not been properly documented. Neither aircraft had yet experienced a failure, most likely because both had lower utilization rates. but Evan's inspection notes were specific about what a failure would have looked like at cruising altitude and why no pilot would have had adequate warning before it mattered. Several board members argued that Evan was positioning himself to extract a long-term contract from the crisis, that his refusal to certify until every component was verified was leverage rather than obligation. Evan asked the board to accept his resignation from the project, effective upon delivery of all documentation to the independent auditors, and the room went quiet because it was not what anyone had expected him to say. He explained that his interest in the outcome was not commercial. The pilots who flew those other 2 aircraft, and every passenger they had carried, had not been parties to any of the decisions that put them at risk, and they deserved the same assessment every aircraft deserved before someone signed their name to it. Vivian authorized the full payment of $240,000, plus applicable interest for late payment, plus reimbursement of every personal advance Evan's team had made during the project. She signed the authorization in front of the auditors, the board, and Evan's team, and she did not ask for any confidentiality agreement, because Evan had already told her he would not sign one. The merger that Miles had been trying to protect collapsed when the counterparty's due diligence team discovered the fleet grounding, and Vivian had already determined that a merger built on a concealed safety liability was not a transaction she was willing to complete. When Evan ran the final check on the Gulfstream's control assembly, he found a wear groove inside the linkage housing, deep, specific, and consistent with the gradual failure mode of an improperly rated component under sustained load. If the aircraft had departed on the morning Vivian had ordered wheels up, the system would most likely have shown its first symptoms somewhere over Virginia, at altitude, with no runway within reach. The wear groove was photographed, measured, and added to the formal report without embellishment, but its presence confirmed what Evan had known from the first night he looked at the aircraft's maintenance history. Someone had prioritized speed over verification, and the margin between the schedule and catastrophe had been much narrower than anyone in the executive tower had understood. Grant stood beside Evan while the measurement was recorded and did not say anything for a long moment, and then he said he had been right to put the logbook down, and Evan said the decision had not required courage. It had required reading. Grant said, without irony, that he had met a great many people who could not manage both. Vivian apologized to each member of Evan's team personally and directly, using neither the language of legal counsel nor the diplomatic register of corporate communications. She said she had been given a picture of the situation that served someone else's purposes, that she had acted on it without asking the right questions, and that she intended to build a reporting structure in which the right questions could be asked without professional consequence. Lena accepted the apology with a directness that did not make it easier or harder than it was. The 2 technicians accepted it and went back to work, because there was still work to do. Evan told Vivian the mistake that mattered most was not trusting Miles. It was the environment in which Miles had been able to operate for years without a single person in the maintenance chain feeling safe enough to raise a formal concern. She asked how to fix that. He said the fix was not a policy document. It was demonstrated behavior over time by the person at the top. She asked if he would lead the aviation safety function. He said he would not take a position inside the structure he had been independent of, because the value of that independence was exactly the thing she had just finished learning about, and that she would be undoing the lesson the moment she absorbed him into the hierarchy. He agreed to a formal independent inspector relationship for Rourke Airworks, with a direct reporting line to the board and no routing through operations management. The arrangement was documented and signed the following week. The bank received full payment and released the lien on the property. Evan settled the quiet loan, Lena had extended to the business during the final weeks of the project, the one she had never mentioned, and he had found only by reviewing the accounts in detail. Lena said it had been a business decision. Evan said he knew it was not, and she said fine, and that was the end of it. The replacement components arrived certified, traceable, and documented to a standard Evan reviewed personally before authorizing installation. When the work was finished and the final inspection sequence was complete, he stood in the cockpit for a moment looking at the instrument panel, at the small clock with the cleaned crystal still mounted above the radio stack, and he signed his name to the airworthiness certificate. Not because Vivian Ashcroft held the title, not because the payment had arrived, not because any schedule required it, but because the aircraft was safe and because that was the only condition under which his signature had ever meant anything. Grant walked to the aircraft first and settled into the left seat without ceremony, beginning his pre-flight checks with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned to trust certain things completely. The pilots who had refused to fly weeks earlier arrived at the field without being summoned and filed their crew documentation without being reminded, because the signature on the release form was the only instrument of reassurance any of them had ever needed. When the Gulfstream reached the runway threshold and its engines rose to takeoff power, Evan stood at the edge of the tarmac and waited for the moment when the wheels would leave the ground. The aircraft broke from the runway cleanly and climbed without hesitation into the morning sky over Charlotte, and the sound of the engines diminished in a long, clean arc until the Gulfstream was a shape against high cloud, doing exactly what it had been built to do. Grant brought it through a full systems evaluation over 2 hours, every surface, every redundant channel, every automated response, and it performed without deviation. When he rolled onto final approach and touched down on the runway, the landing was the kind no one in the aircraft remarks on, because there is nothing to remark on, and that absence of drama was the best possible outcome of everything that had happened before it. Grant came down the aircraft stairs and shook Evan's hand, and said the aircraft was ready to take Vivian anywhere she needed to go, and the word anywhere carried the weight of everything it had cost to make it true. Vivian presented Evan with a physical check in the full invoice amount, signed before her remaining staff and the audit team, and Evan reminded her the wire transfer had already cleared 2 days prior. She said she was aware of that, and that the check was going into a frame in the boardroom, beneath a line engraved on a small brass plate. No schedule, contract, or executive authority stands above the safety of this aircraft. In the months that followed, Rourke Airworks expanded quietly. A second technician hired, a larger diagnostic suite installed, a formal independent inspection agreement, with a regional carrier that had heard about the Ashcroft case through the industry's efficient and informal information network. Vivian held her position as CEO not by managing the story of what had happened, but by making the operational changes visible to everyone in the organization, and by showing up to the maintenance facility herself without staff or prepared agenda to ask questions and listen to the answers. She came to the workshop on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, carrying 2 cups of coffee and no appointment, and she and Evan sat in the small office off the main bay, talking about nothing in particular for a while. Nora called during the conversation, and when Evan came back, he mentioned that his daughter had made a remark about whether a CEO who personally delivered coffee to a maintenance shop and stayed for 2 hours might have interests extending beyond professional oversight. Vivian asked what he had told her. He said he had not said anything. She said she had not said anything either, and she picked up her coffee and looked through the office window at the hangar floor where a new aircraft sat open and waiting. A man walked through the door with a folded set of maintenance records and asked Evan how long it would take to get his airplane flying again. Evan looked at the logbook, turned 3 pages, and said what he always said, "I'm not paid to get it flying. I'm paid to make sure it comes back."